It's Sunday, December the 8th, and this is Trillium Talk, a look inside the week that was in Ontario politics. Welcome back to the show. I'm Scott Sexsmith, and back with us this week is Editor-in-Chief at the Trillium, Jessica Smith-Cross. Welcome back to the show, Jess.
Thanks, Scott. Always good to talk to you.
All right, what a crazy week. It was a big one as the Auditor General released her annual report, and Shelley Spence certainly did not mince any words when it came to some criticisms of the Ford government. We'll get to those in a sec, but for the benefit of the audience, Jess, can you explain what the role of the AG is?
Yeah, so the province's Auditor General has access to all sorts of government documents, and every year goes through all sorts of government spending and does what she calls value for money audits, where she tries to find examples of government waste, things where money isn't being spent well, things where processes aren't working out very well, and then makes recommendations for the government about things that they could do better to get better value for taxpayers' money. So reporters like us, we generally love this because it gives us all kinds of interesting information for stories to write. Opposition parties love this because it gives them all sorts of things to attack the government over, and every government deals with it. There's always waste, and some years the reports are a little bit more damning than others.
And just so I'm clear, the AG has no skin in the game, not tied to any party.
Yeah, she's completely independent. She runs her own audit office of auditors and investigators, and they do their work.
All right, great context. Thanks for that. Okay, let's start with Ontario Place. Spence found that the process that the government used to pick the tenants was an absolute mess. It was irregular, subjective, and not fair. She also found costs are rising well above and beyond what the government initially said. Break it all down for us.
Yeah, so the rehabilitation of Ontario Place has been a big project for the government. It's one that Doug Ford seems to have been very personally invested in. It's also been incredibly controversial. I think a lot of listeners will probably know that the government announced some anchor tenants to build big projects on Ontario Place, the land on the waterfront at Toronto. So one of them is Therme, an Austrian-based spa company that's been given a nearly 100-year lease to build a giant water park and spa on public land right down by the waterfront. A lot of folks in the Toronto area have been very angry about this and organizing against it. The opposition parties have been very opposed to this, as they do. So the auditor did a look at how Therme was chosen as to be this anchor tenant for this land. So they went through the process, the internal government documents on the process that the government started in 2019 to find a winning bidder to get this big lease down in Ontario Place. And what she found was basically a mess. The government didn't use the usual rules around like a big money procurement process where there has to be all sorts of fairness mechanisms in place. This was much looser. It was treated as just a real estate deal. And one of the things that the auditor found was that the government had contact with some of the bidders during the process. Though that included Therme and it included some others as well. And when even though they did assign rankings, so like, okay, of all these bidders, which ones are strong in what area, it then seemed to ignore the own internal rankings that they used and that they also changed halfway through the process. It was just kind of a mess, and it's given a lot of fodder to the opposition critics who hate this project.
All right, let's move to safe consumption sites. The Auditor General found the government doesn't have an up-to-date, coherent opioid strategy. And when it announced the closure of 10 supervised consumption sites, it did so without evaluating the impact on people's lives. Those are some pretty harsh criticisms.
Yeah, so there was an opioid strategy made back in 2016, but a lot has changed since then about even the nature of the opioids that people are using and what it means for their lives and overdoses. Also, during this process, the government announced that it was shutting down 10 supervised injection sites that were nearest to schools, and it won't allow any more to be opened up in the province. And the auditor found that the government did not look into what impact that will have on people's lives. While it did on some level identify the risk of increased deaths from this decision, it didn't do, in very auditor language, anything to mitigate that risk. Now, the government doesn't really see this the same way. They're planning to open what they call heart hubs that give other supportive services, but they don't do any supervised injections or needle exchanges. The auditor did find that of the 10 sites that are going to be closed down, they had reversed 1,500 fatal overdoses in the year that there's most of the recent data for.
All right. And finally, Jess, I guess we're no longer going to be able to call the Liberals one of the progressive parties in Ontario. Bonnie Crombie came out as an anti-woke centrist at a fundraiser this week and declared that identity politics is dead. Alan S. Hale covered that story that, among other things, told us that Crombie's MPPs also voted in favor of the government's bill closing the consumption sites.
Yeah, so this is a bit of a turn for the Liberal Party. It's Bonnie Crombie, the leader who was elected last year, has been clear that she is a centrist, but this was her real big making it clear coming out speech. The identity politics is dead thing was part of that. She said, we're going to stop doing the things that make people hate us. And she made specific reference to the U.S. Democrats lost. There's been a lot of talk among political talking heads since then that wokeness is one of the things that people don't like the Democrats for. So Bonnie Crombie sort of signaled, we're not going to do any of that stuff anymore. We're going to have a few key priorities: reducing taxes, finding everybody a family doctor are chief among them. But we're not going to do that other stuff that makes people hate us. And then shortly after that speech, not all Liberal MPPs voted, but those who did voted in favor of the government's bill closing these supervised injection sites. And that does come despite those MPPs talking about how these sites do save lives. Now, Bonnie Crombie has said that she agrees with the decision not to have them that close to schools. But it was a surprise because it is sort of an endorsement of one of the most controversial things that the Ford government has done, and it wouldn't have been associated at all with the former Liberal Party.
For the most extensive coverage of Ontario politics anywhere, download and subscribe to Trillium Talk wherever you get your favorite podcast. And log on and become a Trillium Insider today at thetrillium.ca. Editor-in-Chief at The Trillium, Jessica Smith-Cross. Thanks as always, Jess. Have a great week.
You too. Thanks so much, Scott.